Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Vlad Stankovic's book, The Natural History of Cryptid Creatures. Sorry. So this is a book that I actually had backed on Kickstarter. Um, Basically, the idea of the natural history of cryptid creatures was to try and create a book that would evoke those of sort of eccentric 18th to early 20th century gentleman's library of curiosities, right? So this was a big thing for the wealthy, the aristocratic, etc., that they would collect stuff. They would collect curiosities, and not just they would collect both like physical curiosities, like you would get, depending on what period, you would get a mummy, for instance, or you would get some sort of tribal talisman from an Amazonian indigenous group, or whatever it is. Like, so you would get this stuff, right? You would get these particular artifacts, but you would also get books. People would collect up libraries of strange and unusual things, travel writing, which during this sort of period often involved just making up crazy shit. But also people were very interested in naturalism, in zoology, in these sort of these disciplines that dealt with the kinds of creatures that existed in the world that were very exotic from the perspective of European and North American, or even sort of aristocratic South American gentlemen, right? Where exactly you lived determined what counted as exotic, right? If you were in South America, then obviously Amazonian or Mayan, Incan, whatever it was, stuff was not nearly as much a curiosity as it would be if you were in Germany or France or whatever it is. But you get my point, right? They collected up these sort of eccentric collections of weird and interesting things. And Stankovic's idea with this was to create a kind of nice quality book that would evoke the kinds of things that were fascinating to these wealthy eccentrics in this sort of weird, like almost steampunk type world, right? And because it is cryptid creatures as opposed to actual naturalism or zoology, there is again this sort of there's a broader term than steampunk, because it's not steampunk as such, but there's sort of gaslight romance almost type aesthetic to it. So that's what the whole idea of the book was. What it is basically is background information on a variety of cryptids. So I'll take you through the table of contents. We have entries on the bunyip, the buru, chupacabra, Dover demon, gigantic octopus, Gloucester sea serpent, jackalope, Kongamato, Loch Ness monster, Mothman, Ogopogo, Ogoikoikoi, Sasquatch, Storjudurant. Some of these I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. That one I'm sure I got wrong. Ogoikoikoi I probably got wrong as well. Sorry. Thunderbird, Yeti, and the Yowie. So that's the set of content that we have. And then what we have for each creature is this sort of basically three things. We have a sort of basic formula. So this is the entry for the bunyip, for instance. So in the page, the text page, we have the origins of this cryptid's legend. So that will include things like where in the world it's located, and some have a very sort of narrow geographic area, like the Loch Ness monster, only in Loch Ness. Some have a much broader geographic region, like Sasquatch, for instance, has been spotted all over North America. um, the origin section will talk about the major sightings, famous famous photos or video of that cryptid, um, and then sometimes sort of explanations that people have proposed for this being a misidentification of an existing creature or a different phenomenon, things like this. So that's the origins portion. Then they have an appearance section. The appearance section talks about what this creature looks like according to reports. And some are very specific, right? Like the Mothman, for instance. My boy, the Mothman, one of the best cryptids ever. The descriptions of the Mothman are relatively coherent, right? There's variation between them, but they're relatively similar. Whereas you look at something like the Buru from India, there's quite a bit of variation here. I think this is the one. No, sorry, this isn't the one that I was really thinking of. There's one of them that I was struck by just how many different varieties of its appearance. Um, I can't find it at the moment, but like this is an interesting component of it, right? Is like because these are not properly zoological creatures, they have not been scientifically determined to exist. We don't have captive examples of them. We don't have clear scientific documentation, measurements, etc., etc. Like what exactly these creatures look like can vary quite widely depending on who is describing them, what sort of view they got of them, how they're sort of looking at things, etc., etc. So again, you have some cryptids where there's a very fairly specific descriptions of it that are recurring, and then some where there's a really broad variation. Some creatures have very limited, again, geographic ranges, and some have much wider geographic ranges. But the other thing that I find very striking is that often there are explanations for these cryptids that sort of discount them as actual creatures. And one of the best examples of this is another one of my favorites, which is the giant octopus, right? Like, things like the Kraken. It's a legend. Whether or not the giant octopus should actually be counted as a cryptid is kind of an interesting question, because we know that there are, in fact, extremely large octopi. There are giant squids, etc., that live out in the ocean. They are actual creatures, and they're scientifically documented. We have evidence of them. For a long time, we didn't have scientific evidence of them, and so they were believed to be myth or legend or cryptids or whatever it was. But we know that these are real, right? We now have indisputable proof that there are very, very large octopi, very, very large squid. The question then becomes, does that explain the cryptid? And this is a thing that Stankovic deals with here in this giant octopus entry. He says, for centuries, an unknown species of a gigantic octopus has been postulated as a source of sea monsters such as Lusca and Kraken. These species are not to be confused with the well-known giant Pacific octopus, which can grow to a total length of more than 20 feet or 6 meters. The mythic gigantic octopus is assumed to be much larger. Okay. So this is an interesting one, right? Is like, this is one where you have a legitimately existing creature that matches the rough description of the cryptid, but it's assumed not to be the cryptid because the cryptid is believed to be much larger. Now, in principle, the existing Pacific octopus and other sort of gigantic octopi, you could have an unusually large specimen that would account for the cryptid version, the mythic version of the gigantic octopus. But you also may just have occasional sightings of a 20-foot-long Pacific octopus that, because people are bad at guessing lengths and sizes of things, especially in the water, and especially when those things are moving, or when you're moving, like you would be on a ship, and especially because tails get expanded, I mean, that 20-foot octopus suddenly becomes a 40-foot octopus in the story. And so this is an interesting thing. It's like there is this sort of question about cryptid studies, right? Is that when you have evidence that there is a particular thing that provides a good explanation for what that cryptid might be, how many hoops are you willing to jump through to maintain the existence of that cryptid? I think that's an interesting question, right? Is like, we know that there are octopi that would roughly account for the gigantic octopus cryptid. Do we say, okay, this is no longer a cryptid, or do we say, well, there's a bigger one that's still a cryptid? And it's interesting. I find cryptozoology really fascinating, in part for this reason, because it's not necessarily clear that there are things that are unlikely to really exist, right? I think as much as I like the idea of a Sasquatch, I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that there's a large primate wandering the basically entirety of North America that science hasn't discovered. It seems to me quite unlikely. Giant octopi, on the other hand, totally willing to accept that. The ocean's weird and mysterious and stuff, and we don't know that much about it. But this is sort of one of the interesting things, right? Is like, these things could exist, and we do discover new species all the time. And so there may be evidence that we find for the existence, like proper, legitimate scientific evidence for the existence of a Sasquatch or a bunyip or a jackalope or whatever it is. We may get it.